Hello and welcome. You are listening to Mergers and Acquisitions, a multimedia blog and podcast series produced by the Society for Economic Anthropology and in cooperation with the American Anthropological Association. We'll be coming to you each quarter with a new collection of blog posts and podcasts centered on a theme with relevance to economic anthropology. Our first collection, produced by SEA member Anil Tripathy, focuses on the contributions of economic anthropologists to the study of climate change. You can find those episodes by subscribing to the podcast on the Society for Economic Anthropology's website or by searching using your preferred podcast service. My name is Cindy Eisenhower. Please join me this spring as we explore our second theme, the economic anthropology of discard. In a world with increased virgin resource scarcity, climate change, growing inequality, and the coming end of cheap nature, how might we come to rethink value? How might we reimagine value generation and critically interrogate the dominant economic logics that at once tell us there is scarcity and simultaneously produce an abundance of waste? How might we best understand the various people who, for a range of reasons and rationales, work to recover the value left behind by capitalist ruins? And how can we understand the various forms and practices of salvaging and circulating value, those that have been around as long as anyone can remember, and those that are just emerging in the cracks of a failing system? My guest this spring will help us to think through these questions and surely many others. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Waqas Butt. Waqas is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto Scarborough. His research interests include caste, work and labor, waste, infrastructures, development, and value. Much of Waqas's work is based on long-term fieldwork in Pakistan, in Lahore, and the Punjab. Waqas is the author of Waste, Intimacies, Caste and the Unevenness of Life in Urban Pakistan, which appeared last year in American Ethnologist. He is currently working on a book project that explores the ways in which waste workers, who predominantly represent low or non-caste groups, have become essential components of urban life and waste infrastructures. Welcome, Waqas. So let's just start off with a really broad question, if I may. Can you just tell us a bit more about your work there? I'm sure we have some listeners who are not yet familiar. They're lost with your work, and hopefully they will become more acquainted soon. So what is it that you've been working on, and how can we relate that to the interests of anthropologists who are primarily concerned with economic life and economic structure?
Of course. All right. Thank you for the question. Also, we're very excited to be here and have this conversation with you. So, I think as a way of introducing my work, so most of my work is based in Pakistan, specifically in the city of Lahore, which is in the province of Punjab. And I also did some field work in sort of towns and cities nearby. And so the focus of my work has been on very broadly waste, of course, and sort of thinking around waste and all its sort of different material forms that it kind of takes, and also waste as sort of a kind of a category or sort of a conceptual category that brings together all these different kinds of material things and processes and actions and all this kind of stuff. So like wastefulness. So part of my work has been looking at that. And of course, with economic anthropology and the sort of category of waste as sort of always being opposed to this thing called value, whatever value is. And so, waste itself is like a very central category for economic life, whether that's sort of a capitalist economy. People have talked about waste in socialist economies, communist regimes, all this kind of stuff. So waste, I think, for economic anthropology is a very central category. It could be a very central category. And I think people are, taking that up more and more. So that's sort of, it directly sort of bears on questions of economic life or economic structures. My work has been really focused in on, I've used the term waste work quite a bit. And so it's really around the sort of question of labor around waste materials, labor or work, and we can define what the difference between work and labor is and this kind of stuff. Very broadly, I'm looking at any type of work that is remunerated for working with waste materials, right? That could be, I've been working and thinking about sort of the question of informal labor and informal economies, which we can sort of come back to later. So, not all labor is remunerated with a salary. We all kind of know that. So part of my work is looking at how do people make a life out of waste, working with waste materials? How is a whole sort of economic infrastructure built upon this labor, which is fundamentally infrastructural in nature, in the sense that it moves waste materials around. And so part of it is the sort of taking away of waste or the disposing of waste, but it's a lot. Some of that labor is also around, buying and selling, and so sorting waste, disassembling waste. All these sorts of practices are really important. And so, I'm really looking at kind of how part of my work and part of the book I'm working on right now is looking at sort of what is the labor market look like around waste, right? And so what role does the state, the Pakistani state, as far as municipal departments, municipal institutions, and actors, what role do they have in organizing this labor market? And how does this labor market sort of organize on its own kinds of, for lack of a better term, sort of autonomously from the state, from state institutions, because it's so informalized, for lack of a better term. And so, the last part of my work, which I think is really important, which is probably what I've written most about so far, has been kind of on this sort of the casted nature of this work, right? So the role that caste as sort of, caste has, it's a really, as a system and these kinds of things. There's many definitions for it. I'm not in a place to sort of decide this long debate around what caste is. But there's a few things that are important as far as my work goes. And that's sort of, how does caste sort of operate as a system of social stratification? And so part of this part of my work looks at how the urban landscape, the city itself, right, of Lahore has, if we look at kind of waste work and how waste moves and who works within all these things, we can look at sort of how, the city is sort of spatially stratified as well as sort of just distributive processes more generally. And so, just sort of maybe to give a sense of why caste matters. I think most people are sort of aware of caste as far as the Indian caste system and these kinds of things. And so that's very much part of what I'm interested in looking at. But there's the question of caste is much broader than just Hinduism within South Asia, right? There's so. For example, in my work, the municipal sanitation workers who are employed by the municipality are predominantly Christian, and that partly arises out of these conversion from sort of Dalit groups, which are sort of known as low or non-caste Hindus. There was a large conversion of them from the 1880s to the 1930s and 40s to Christianity, as well as other religions, but to Christianity in the Punjab area of India, British India. And so that's part of the municipal workers are entirely Christian for kind of that reason. And they come from predominantly one sort of caste group. And then sort of informal waste workers who are predominantly working in the actual collection of waste from households and this kind of stuff are also from a Dalit low or non-caste group but are predominantly Muslim, right? So there are, and they also converted to Islam. It's all, some of this is all very unclear. It's sort of based off of personal biographies, so, but they converted throughout the colonial period. Prior to that, I mean, there's long histories of conversion too. I mean, it's really hard to determine this kind of stuff. But, so the informal sector, especially at this level of waste disposal from households, is dominated by, a couple of groups who would be considered Dalit, or also some who would be considered, the Urdu term for this is Khana Badosh, who are seen as like nomadic groups, or quote unquote gypsy types of communities in the region. And so there's this huge sort of casted element to this work, which has a lot to do with how, the colonial regime sort of organized caste, and through governance, and this kind of stuff has to do with like just social norms and codes and these kinds of stuff. So, part of my work has been trying to really take seriously these histories of labor and caste and governance and urban development in the region, and sort of bringing them to bear on something like, labor as a category, right? Or this capitalism as an economic system, right? And how, and I think this is increasingly, being recognized, but that how something like economic structures depend upon various kinds of historical difference, right? Whether that be race or gender or class, in this case, caste, and how they sort of both draw upon and, tend to reproduce these sorts of forms of difference and inequality, right? So that's really, very broadly, sort of where my work has been going and developing over the past, almost decade at this point. But yeah,
that's excellent. And so you're working on a book that will encapsulate all this work. What's your timeline? Is it something we can look for soon, we hope?
Yeah, hopefully. Soon is a relative thing, right? Depending on how everything goes within a year or two. It sort of brings all this together within sort of thinks about reproduction and waste work as reproductive in nature. And so it thinks about, reproduction at sort of multiple scales, like both kind of the reproductive labor, waste work as reproductive labor in the sense of it's being, in a way that like most forms of care work are, right? They're directed at others and these kinds of things, but also these kinds of questions of social reproduction and reproducing sort of historical forms of inequality and this kind of stuff. So
super.
The book really focuses on reproduce. The title right now is Reproducing Lahore. So it's really interested in kind of, how in reproducing this thing called the city, how do all these other things get reproduced along the way too? And the economy itself, right, is being reproduced in these processes.
So you write in your American Ethnologist piece, Waste Intimacies. I found that a really great article, and I hope that readers will go seek it out. But you talk about how workers, both formal and informal, engage in intimate forms of labor that separate the materials from those who produce them. And you're telling us that, and I think this is largely true, that the role that historical inequalities have played in constituting intimacy have largely been left unexplored. We oftentimes think of intimacy in very different registers, but your work is helping us to understand an intimacy that's formed through these everyday practices, but also, long histories of inequality. Can you talk a bit more about that and explain to the readers what you mean by waste intimacies?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really good question. I think this is something common in sort of households in Pakistan and South Asia generally, where, there is a lot of domestic workers and domestic labor that come into the household to do various kinds of work, usually quite often service related work. The sort of the discomfort that comes with allowing someone into your domestic space as someone and providing care for you and providing this kind of stuff, and sort of the ambivalences around caste and class sort of hierarchies and how people have to navigate them. So I was reading about that. I was sort of thinking about these things, but then I wanted to expand that out less between the kind of like, oh, here's a worker and here's the household that they work with and they have some ambivalence with each other, right? Which is like kind of known, right? And we kind of could assume that. And I wanted to think like both implode the scales of that kind of like interactional model of intimacy, but then like expand it a little bit to like think about these different scales at which this intimacy is playing out. So, part of the article is sort of trying to understand how do like the domestic work or the care work that's happening in these households around removal of waste shapes, this other space where the waste workers live and reside and their sort of families inhabit, right? So these sort of jugis or huts that they existed, but also, the relationships between, these junkyard owners and these waste workers too, like how fraught are those interactions because of this sort of allegation or potential allegation of your caste background or your status or your true real identity, right? I mean, now to come back to the intimacy stuff, like intimacy is like a central category or central problem for, anthropologists. Like it's like it's the bedrock of ethnography on some level, the sort of question of the intimacy that we have because of ethnography, but ethnography itself is sort of requires this estrangement or this sort of distance and all this kind of stuff, right? Which I think is super interesting. And I mean, I still think about it, but it didn't necessarily get me to think around, right? That like intimacy is both like this really close proximal thing, but then can be, can be experienced from a distance as well, right? So I think I eventually came to this sort of thing of that, how do we understand this form of intimacy as, what I was saying earlier of like taking various forms of difference, historical difference, and building itself, like those forms of difference are kind of like an infrastructure for this intimacy, right? It becomes the possibility for people to engage in a particular way. And in that process, those forms of difference also transform. They're not like static in any way. We rely upon these forms of difference to give us some sort of sense of each other, who we are and this kind of stuff. But it's always kind of, I think I say it's like they're faulty grounds, right? It's like people are trying to find their footing on something that doesn't have stability or anything like that, right? And so, I think that article is this attempt to kind of say that like these really intense social relations, right, are built upon these forms of historical difference. And, even something, and this is pretty well established, or people have written about quite a bit, that even sort of this invocation of love or friendship or all these kinds of things can involve not just these forms of difference, but also these forms of inequality and mm-hmm. violence too, right? That like love and care, people have talked about this, have a certain kind of violence embedded in them too, right? And so that was sort of what I was trying to unpack all of that through this sort of framing, using the framing of intimacy, right?
Great. And I thought you did a really nice job, and I learned an awful lot from the piece for sure. So thank you for that.
Of course.
So let's turn now a little bit away from the micro scale and localized relations, and think a little bit about how those relations are structured in larger frames. Mm-hmm. So you write at one point in the same piece that in many urban centers of the world today, livelihoods, especially those of surplus populations in the global South, have become increasingly and precariously tied to working with material excess or the excesses of contemporary capitalism. You go on to say the expansion of such livelihoods is connected to the reorganization of social life through a range of distributive processes. One of which is the uneven distribution of waste across the social body. So I wonder if I wonder, and you say that this is very akin to domestic caregiving and sex work, some of the other care types of work that you've already mentioned. So I'm just wondering, how when you're an anthropologist, right, and you're working in a local community and working with people in their everyday lives, it's sometimes, difficult to make those connections out to broader kind of structural issues. But it seems here that you've got a strong interest in these larger kind of theories about globalization and maybe even world systems inspired types of analyses. How do you do that when you're working, in a local ethnographic context? How have you attempted to kind of branch out to think about some of those larger processes at play here?
I think have been very, on the level of sort of ethnography, being very sort of attentive to sort of micro practices or micro relationships and these kinds of things. Well, one thing, I think one of the ways which, anthropologists or people doing this kind of work have been really are how can I say this, like specially situated, right, to connect on this thing and this issue, and that has to do with sort of the passage that you read out just now of like, the question that as commodity consumption has just sort of risen over the past several decades. How has that created a market for this kind of labor, right, and these kinds of materials, right? And I think so. So this question of informal labor or informal economies. I think that's very. Precisely because it's sort of happening outside of. This is a strong term. I don't want to stay by, but somewhat outside of state regulation or sort of contractual labor or these sort of recognized domains of economic activity. And of course, like the whole idea of the informal labor is connected to Keith Hart and all these kinds. So there is this history around it. But even in this current sort of moment, I think, and you look at, and this is very much a structural kind of economic issue of like, anthropologists and people doing ethnography are really looking at the gig economy as sort of like the informalization of labor as well, right, happening in the global north. So I think one way that I've remained attentive to kind of these issues that you're bringing up of sort of maybe more structural or macro level sort of processes is through this sort of like question of informal economies, right? And I think, I think there's some hesitance I have around, connecting something like informal waste work in Pakistan to a gig worker in, whatever, the Bay Area or something like that. Those are very different historical conditions and these kinds of things. So I don't want to collapse these two things, but I think, as far as the economic anthropologists go, there is something that's happening with labor right now, of course, that like is requiring some sort of political recognition, some sort of political engagement with, that, this whole kind of politics of distribution too, people don't have access to work in a sort of traditional way. And even if they ever had, we don't know. That's a historical debate. And so how do you deal with that for sort of doing anthropological or sort of any kind of work like that? I think my approach to a lot of these questions is through some of the work coming out of, South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, from post-colonial studies, really, which is, but really thinking around how, like, this question of not historical difference in the sense of like, caste or race and gender kind of things, but how do we reconcile the histories of something like capitalism as sort of this world historical thing or whatever, and all the various sort of various kinds of histories, right, that are part of that, part of those processes, right, and get incorporated into them or don't get incorporated into them. So that's sort of how I've sort of adopted. And there are some things that I, are in snippets in my work around thinking of, I look at something like price, right? The setting of prices for a certain material, right? A certain type of copper or a certain type of, and how those are connected to, various like global markets, right? So, the most traditional example of this would be plastic, right? The price of plastic is connected to the price of petroleum, right? So that it is part of this sort of, and also the price of petroleum is connected to the US dollar. So that's all kind of these things that, which are very fascinating connections. I don't necessarily, I chose not to study them, partly because then the story becomes this sort of like global economy stuff happening, and not necessarily these like labor practices that I'm really interested in. And it's like, it is a question of scale, like but it's also a question of just kind of where we give our attention to
Right.
as we do our work. So one thing that I want to bring up, which directly ties to this sort of a larger theory of world systems, or sort of like the sort of globalization and the global economy, is sort of this emergence of China as sort of this global economic actor and sort of producer of commodities, as well as their sort of the kinds of economic activities that they're sort of getting involved in sort of in Pakistan, but throughout countries in the global south, and Africa and the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Latin America to a certain extent as well. So they're very involved in various sectors of Pakistan's economy at this moment through this sort of big initiative called CPEC, which is the Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is very much about China's. It's very unclear what it's all about because there's so much shrouding and this kind of stuff. But some of it is getting Chinese goods out through a port in Pakistan, in the southern part of Pakistan that the Chinese have helped to build. So it's a large infrastructure stuff. So that's a separate part of the story. But as far as the waste stuff goes, I mean, there was an interesting kind of, the idea of Chinese goods was something that waste workers actively talked about, right? It was something that they were, and quite often it was cheap Chinese commodities that were imported into Pakistan were seen as lower quality. The higher quality, like coppers and this kind of stuff, were seen to be being exported to China, right? So there's this weird kind of relationship that was being imagined, with China as an extractor of, high quality recyclable materials, like high quality copper, and from them getting sort of basically cheap trash that we could use and reuse here. And so there is, I think, and aside from that sort of discourse, there is a large expansion of Chinese manufactured goods in Pakistan and, in a lot of places. But it was clearly that's something that was shaping the kind of labor market. And and also, there's some other stuff on sort of metal markets too, and how that shapes the price of metals in the informal economy as well.
Super interesting. It seems like no matter where someone you're talking to is working, there's China somehow figuring in the conversation recently. Yeah. Super. So that's really interesting. I want to jump back quickly to the kind of any parallels that exist between the gig economy and the informal work that you study. Seems like that's certainly changing, right? The shape of labor is changing. And I also think, in terms of discard studies and waste, it seems like maybe there is a shift in how a lot of folks are thinking about what waste is, particularly in the context of all these discussions about the circular economy, right? And that we, no longer should we be calling it waste, but instead materials or resources. Right. And so I just wanted to ask you, I've been curious about this for people who work with pickers or informal waste workers in a lot of different contexts. There's so much discussion now about the circular economy. And of course, some of our colleagues have referred to waste and discards as the new commodity frontier, which makes a lot of sense, right? I'm just curious to get some of your thoughts on this. A lot of regions and localities are working very actively on circular economy policy, much of it focused on end of life, waste materials management. Just curious, what do you think that means for some of the folks that you've worked with? Do you see these movements toward a more circular economic form as potentially beneficial, or potentially even increasing levels of vulnerability, or potentially both?
I think there's the circular economy itself is like an imaginative project, right? Of just kind of this thing that it's just circulation is just happening, right? It's just perfect, it's smooth, there's no hiccups and this kind of stuff. It can be trash, and it can be a resource, and it can be goods, and it can be all these different things depending on the moment at which it can be a mode of subsistence. That's people talk about it in that way. And so, this question of beneficial or increasing vulnerability, within Pakistan, I mean, from what I gathered, there's no necessarily like state policy on a circular economy or anything like that. I mean, there's definitely state policies on, pollution and environmental harm, these kinds of things, solid waste management. I mean, there are these things, but, in the way that, I've read about with the EU, like a very adopting a policy around the circular economy and this kind of stuff. So that hasn't there. That said, I mean, there's, within this context, and I think within a lot of contexts, at least in India and within South Asia, around, how the circular economy and sort of becomes a sort of a developmental kind of project, right? It sort of gets connected to like World Bank type of stuff and projects and this sort of like experts that kind of grow up around this idea of the circular economy. So that's one issue. I mean, the question of the circular economy, I mean, I think has to be differentiated in that way, right? There's the sort of experts around the circular economy, and then there's sort of the labor that is the actual circular economy, right? And so I think this beneficial or increasing vulnerability question is really around, that's the tension, right? Is actually between who is this sort of circular economy. Within Latin America, there's been a lot of cooperatives around waste stuff that have been very successful, that aren't necessarily the circular. I don't think they use the language, and I think they pre-exist the circular economy type of stuff. And so I think that, I mean, with the kind of people that I worked with, I mean, they're extremely, they're not organized in any sort of through any sort of cooperative. So there's been sort of ideas around that as well. So I think there's definitely a fear, and it's very well-grounded fear, that any sort of intervention by any sort of state affiliated actor is going to disrupt their access to waste, and cause further precarity, right? I mean, that's something I wrote is really about that, looking at the struggles around waste between, the state's intervention to, they privatize the waste management system. And part of that was trying to start a system of the door-to-door collection, and that led to a conflict between these informal workers and sort of state institutions. So I think that's quite often, I mean, if I were to speculate, I think that's where the increasing vulnerability would come from, is that, the logic of a circular economy is around, and the state would be around sort of efficiency, management, and these kinds of things. And for waste workers, who, especially the sort of at the level of the waste workers, and not necessarily this higher level of traders and like middlemen, right, who are like buying and selling these materials. For waste workers, a crucial element of this is to be able to be strategic about, buying and selling. And it's not predicated upon this idea of like an efficient model of like how to get materials circulated. It's right. Like organized around all the household stuff that they need to do and the debts that they have. They're indebted. There's this intense indebtedness that happens. So it's around those dynamics that people relate to these waste materials, right? So sometimes they'll hold on to them for several months, being like, well, if a price shoots up, then I'll sell it. And this kind. So they operate almost as savings, right? The waste materials operate as these savings that people have, which, would not, I don't know, I can't see how that would square with a circular economy type of model, where it's about some sort of like efficient movement of materials, and it's reuse and repurposing and this kind of stuff. And so that's where I would say, that there is a well-founded fear that their vulnerability would increase, not because of any clear, like, you guys can't even, we're going to exploit you because we want your materials, but more what you need to be doing with these materials that like gets afforded to you because of your informal relations of work, those are going to be, transform and reworked. And that might lead to, you can't save your waste, you can't hold on to your waste materials as a form of saving, right?
Yeah. This has me thinking a little bit about notions of property too. I mean, I think that, I think some of the fears around increasing circularity is this idea that waste, the property of waste itself becomes kind of niched only and, certain ownership models. How does it work in Pakistan? I mean, is the waste is the property of the generator until it's picked up, and then it's the property of the collector?
like on a legal level, in like cases in the United States and Europe, there have been various court cases that have been adjudicated on this, right? So I was reading, or someone I was having a conversation where I forget where it was, a European country where like if you left your garbage on the street and something got taken from there, whatever, I don't know, some sort of like dangerous weapon or something like that, you would still be held accountable because it's technically still your property, right? That's being used or something. And, those kinds of court cases haven't been taken up with in the case of Pakistan, right? So that kind of, but it's very clear that, the waste is the property of the household until it's taken away, right? But there's an ambiguity also here too, because, the municipal institutions, for the most part, are only required, I'm forgetting the exact language, but in previous municipal laws, waste material, so like what would be rubbish, I mean, they don't say waste materials in the thing, but it would be like dust, rubbish, these kinds of terms that they use, was at one point in municipal institutions was a vested asset of the municipality, right? And so the state, but only in public spaces, right? So it wasn't like waste in households, which was seen as sort of an asset of the municipality, but this public space, waste materials in public space, right? Like, but that's clear. There's a lot of ambiguity around that. Like, what's public space? Like, how is dust? Or I think they actually use dust in one of the municipal things. Like, how is that anyone's asset and this kind of stuff, right? And so, there's all this ambiguity around who this is. But I think the state, as it becomes more involved in the sort of the waste infrastructure, the waste management system, increasingly tries to exercise control over these materials, and uses not necessarily the language that this is our property, but that this is in public space and we have control over public spaces, and therefore we're the ones who are seen as the managers of it, right? I think on the level of now, I mean, the question of like property, like as it gets collected and moves through, I don't think, something I did think about sort of property and waste through the question of the state, like the state's relationship to this. But in that article, I never really dealt with the question of like, well, these people who are like buying and selling these materials, like, do they have any sense that this is their property? And I actually don't think they see it as their property. They see it as like something that they have, right? They might, the term that people quite often use for this material is the Urdu Punjabi word for it is bachat, which is kind of like remainder, leftover profit, right? So they would separate like the garbage, the kachra, from this bachat, which is like seen as the remainder of profit, right? You can use it in various contexts like that.
Yeah.
And that's what they would take home to either store or sell to the junkyard owners and the middlemen and this kind of stuff, right? But it was never seen, property. I mean, I would have to think through this a little bit, but like it was never, there's no articulation of the model of like property as sort of some sort of like legal category and rights to access and this kind of stuff. Like the rights of access was there. I think that there was a kind of conversation around that, but not in the way that this is our property and we have certain rights of control and access and this kind of stuff. It wasn't fleshed out in that way, even in sort of everyday discourse.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I guess I'm not surprised either, right? It seems to exist in this liminal space. If you can make use of it, then I do a lot of work on reuse economies. And even when people are intentionally salvaging things for resale, they still don't really necessarily consider it theirs or their property. But I do wonder, as if and when circular economy discourses and policies advance, if that will change, there'll be more discussions about like who technically or legally owns something. So,
I mean, there's also, just really quickly, you also brought up this sort of other category of resource, right? I mean, that's another thing that I've been thinking about. And I use the language of resource when I talk about the informal economy, because from the perspective of manufacturers, it is a resource that they need to supply into the production process. And so that resourcing, that idea of resource makes sense to me. I just think, once again, I think that when people, workers or the traders, even the middlemen, they don't see it as, they may be part of the supply chain and see that they're supplying these factories, but they see the materials very much as some sort of like thing to like exchange and buy and sell and goods. I mean, that was the kind of thing that people did use a lot. They would talk about like an arrival, or the arrival of the goods, and especially the traders and middlemen. I mean, they're traders, right? They see themselves as buying and selling goods between people. So, which doesn't fit the property thing, and it doesn't fit the resource either. It's a kind of much more, I mean, I've thought about this sort of like these merchants, like the sort of merchant type of activity.
You say in the American Ethnologist that these materials are seen as a source of monetary worth that offer at least the prospect of upward mobility.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Waqas, it's been really great to talk to you, and I've enjoyed meeting you and learning more about your work. Thanks to all of you who tuned in today for my conversation with Dr. Waqas Butt. Next in the lineup is an interview with Brianne Berry, a recent PhD and a student of mine from the University of Maine. And that will be the end of the Discard series before we turn it over to Ipshita Ghosh for the next collection of mergers and acquisitions.